Anyway, so um, to continue our discussion on the book Beyond Innocence and Redemption, I would like to focus our conversation uh, this time on Holocaust theology, which is the first chapter of the book. And I would like to begin by a quotation from the first chapter. And it's, every theology represents an argument, a series of choices where one begins historically, what understandings and movements one includes, and thus decisions of who is within or outside the argument. So this Holocaust theology is no exception. So I think there are four parts in that statement that would frame our discussion uh, tonight morning, your time. That this theology represents an argument, and the choices that one has to make in relation to that argument, that choices has to begin historically, what is included and what is excluded in that decision. Okay, so so that's how I would like to frame the discussion. So let's begin with the argument. And Holocaust theology is an argument, and the arguments are represented by three thinkers: Elie Wiesel, Fackenheim, Emile Fackenheim, and Rabbi Greenberg. Okay, so let us begin there. So what are the arguments that they have presented that form the foundation of Holocaust theology?
Well, first we have to step back for a second, because theology in a people's history comes from formative events. Not just a date, this happened in 522, 525, April 8th, it's not a linear history. Theology comes from formative events in a people's history. So for instance, the Exodus, or for Christians, the coming of Jesus. But those are initial formative events of the community, and the way the people look at those events, right, as formative. But then there are other formative events that happen in history. Say, the rise of Constantinian Christianity is a formative event for Christianity, but also in a very negative way for Jews. So theology emerges from formative events, and what Holocaust theologians said, and I think quite properly, that the formative events of our time were Holocaust and the establishment of the State of Israel, and that any theology would have to come within and out of that. So their argument is, we have had a number of formative events in Jewish history, but in our time, in a very short time, usually these formative events happen once every 500 years or 1,000 years, and all of a sudden, in the 1930s and 40s, there are two formative events: the destruction of European Jewry, the mass murder, and the establishment of an empowered Jewish presence in Israel. And all of Holocaust theology revolves around looking at the Holocaust and why that's a formative event, and what it means as a formative event in terms of a future, which Holocaust theologians say is empowerment in Israel. That's the general argument. Then there has to be defenses against other arguments, like the Holocaust is one among other formative events. Why do you make that so significant? Or we've lived without a state forever. Why do you argue that it is a state? So Holocaust theology is a very powerful and often nuanced argument for the inclusion of Holocaust in Israel as formative, and the exclusion of criticism of Holocaust as formative and Israel as formative. These theologians, Wiesel and Fackenheim and Greenberg, as well as my teacher, Richard Rubenstein, spent many years discussing this and arguing that the Holocaust in Israel were central, and especially against others who said it wasn't, including, by the way, the Jewish establishment in the United States that didn't want, like all establishments, new formative events to take on their power. So this was not only an argument against critics of the Holocaust as central and critics of Israeli power, but criticism from the Jewish establishment in America that had its own power and structures and saw that if the Holocaust in Israel was recognized as a formative event, as formative events, they would be disempowered. So they were arguing against critics on both sides of the issue.
Mm-hmm. Now, going back to the formative events of Holocaust theology, and the Holocaust happened, between 1941 to 1945, and the Holocaust theology was articulated 20 years later. So, that for me, it's very interesting. Why did it take 20 years before such a very an important event could only be articulated 20 years later?
Actually, that's a short time in a people's history.
Uh-huh.
When you have the trauma that Jews experienced in Europe, you don't wake up the next day and understand it all and be able to articulate it and name it, because once it's named, you're in a new situation. And all of these movements of liberation theology, for example, Black liberation theology and feminist liberation theology and theologies around the world, are basically naming events that are formative, but they're not typically named the day after. So, the experience in Latin America of Christianity wasn't named right away. It may have been named almost 500 years later. So when you have this kind of trauma, collective for a people, but also personal, you usually don't wake up the next day and say, yeah, I got it. I know what this means. So these theologians in the 1960s, it was building. But again, there were critics on all sides. And then it named something very, very, very powerful within the Jewish consciousness that people said, that's it. And like in these other movements like feminism and Black theology, these theologians didn't make something up. They named what people were beginning to feel. They articulated what people were feeling. That's the power of Holocaust theology, that many Jews recognized this as central when it was finally spoken, which was quite early in a way, in terms of a collective history and a people's history, but delayed in terms of our linear history and saying, well, tomorrow we'll understand what happened today.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's a very good point. Considering, for example, in the Philippines, it's been more than 30 years since the EDSA People Power uprising happened, and although it was named right after, but actually the meaning, especially when something significant also happened in relation to it, that it's the meaning shifts.
Well, your 500th year anniversary of Christianity coming to the Philippines, and in my view, the Philippines still hasn't named that trauma.
You may be right. You may be right.
See, you look at Christianity around the world in its expansion as traumatic. liberation theology, Catholic and Protestant, really begins to name the coming of Christianity, even though they're Christians, as a trauma. So look how long it took for liberation theology, say in Latin America, to name the coming of Christianity really deeply as traumatic. And then the question is, what do you do with that trauma? And Holocaust theology is, what do we do with this? And somebody say, well, don't do anything with it. Just let it go. But it's this kind of massive trauma just sits there. And then finally, one day, it's articulated and people say, that's what we've been through. What are we going to do now? And the answer of Holocaust theologians was, empower Israel. That is your commitment to the continuation of Jewish history, because Hitler and others tried to end Jewish history. And Holocaust theologians were saying, this can't be our end. What is our future? Empowerment. What's the concrete representation of that empowerment? Israel. Every Jew and others have to get on board. And anyone who's not on board, they argued, is either a self-hating Jew or is anti-Semitic. So it's very strong. But remember too, when Wiesel started speaking about the Holocaust, most Jews didn't want to listen, and especially the Jewish establishment. Later, they embraced him. They loved him. But they loved him partly because the only way they could survive was through him. Holocaust theology was an insurgent theology. It was not immediately accepted. It was rejected by many. It was insurgent. Later, and very quickly, it became a new orthodoxy, where it then rejected and excluded other theologies that challenged it.
Okay, we will go back to the point of anti-Semitism, the new anti-Semitism as discussed by Rabbi Greenberg. But I want to go back to Elie Wiesel, because his articulation of Holocaust theology, as you said in your book, has something to do with the Eichmann trial and the 1967 war. So, I mean, how did that change? I mean, how did they articulate it before the Eichmann trial, or in between the 1967 war?
Well, these were also events in history. So Eichmann was captured and brought to Israel for trial. Eichmann was a person who was one of the enablers of the Holocaust. So he escaped, captured, brought to Israel for a trial. And there at the trial was, among others, Hannah Arendt and Elie Wiesel. Wiesel as a reporter and Hannah Arendt as a reporter or a columnist on it. And this is a big trial because this was, as Richard Rubenstein said, the first time that Jews in our history, at least in the last 2,000 years, could try people who committed crimes against Jews. Because in our disempowerment, Jews didn't have their own courts for those who oppressed us. And often they were given free rein to oppress us or to do whatever they wanted, including the Catholic Church. Now we could take a criminal, mass murderer, an enabler of mass murder, and we could try him. So it was a big deal, Eichmann on trial. And the question was, which way would that go? Was Eichmann committing crimes against humanity with what he did to Jews? Okay, that was one way, and that was Hannah Arendt's sense. Or was Eichmann committing crimes against the Jewish people, which also affected humanity? That was Wiesel. And so there was an argument brewing in the Jewish world about what Eichmann represented. So Hannah Arendt writes a series of articles for the New Yorker and later publishes a book on Eichmann as a cog in the machine, someone who was basically not that bright and probably didn't hate Jews, and it didn't matter. He wanted to move up in his career in the Nazis. And Wiesel said, no. He was an anti-Semite who wanted to kill Jews and eliminate Jews from the world. That was a huge discussion. Oh my God, very emotional discussion still going on today. What were the Nazis about, and what were people like Eichmann about? And what should Jews do about people like Eichmann if we could get our hands on them? This was a big thing. So then the 67 war, and this is very close, 1961, 62, and 1967. So again, these are, 1945, World War II ends, 1948, Israel is created. We're into the 1960s. Again, very compressed for a people's history. And in the 67 war, many Jews, including Wiesel, and including Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was very progressive politically in the United States and lost many of his family members in the Holocaust, he just escaped. So again, it's all very present, the Holocaust. And Wiesel also lost family in the Holocaust and escaped. So these are present in individual lifetimes and in a collective memory. And in the 67 war, those Jews felt that if the Arab countries won that war, Israel would be defeated and Jews would be annihilated. That is a second Holocaust. So whether that was true or not, that's a different issue. I'm talking about how it was discussed then. So the 67 war was a hugely emotional issue where Jews, with our own power, that is Jewish military in the state of Israel, the Jewish state, won. We weren't defeated like in the Nazi period. We weren't almost exterminated because of our weakness by the Nazis. We weren't made refugees. We won. And that became, that when we won, actually that's when Holocaust theology became named and became an orthodoxy for the Jewish community. When we recognized that we had power, we could name our victimhood. So they were named Holocaust in Israel as central to Jewish history, as formative events. It was started before, but in through Eichmann and the 67 war, it was named and became an orthodox theology and consciousness throughout the Jewish world.
Yeah. Now, you said that Wiesel named that orthodoxy. And actually in your book, and here I have made a note on this, what you said about the dialectical tension allows Jewish suffering to point to the miracle of Israel's victory, yet not be consumed by it. The redemptive aspects of Israel continually evoke Jewish innocence because of the absolutely unjustified sufferings of Jews in Europe. In a sense, Wiesel recreates the rhythms of contemporary Jewish life, almost as a liturgy, and suggests avenues of Jewish commitment within those rhythms. So I've actually, this reminds me of the new Kaddish, what Wiesel has, in a way, articulated as a new Kaddish for the suffering of the Jewish people, evoking, innocence.
When you listen to Wiesel over the years or read him, he doesn't evoke a linear history. His speech and his patterns and his imagery is liturgical. This is what's so powerful. It's sort of like my discussions with Christians about the Gospels being anti-Jewish as read in church. And they say, no, we explain it to the people. We explain that that's the wrong interpretation. We explain it, we explain it, we explain it, we explain it, and we explain it again. And I say, it doesn't matter. When it's heard liturgically, people aren't thinking in linear history. They don't have a chalkboard and say, oh, this isn't anti-Jewish. This isn't the, you're taking in a series of images that are deeply personal, collective, and meaningful. Wiesel doesn't articulate a linear history of the Holocaust, and he doesn't articulate a linear history of the state of Israel. These are liturgical elements that fashion a way for Jews to embrace contemporary Jewishness, so that Israel's victory is not really a military victory like how many arms do you have, how are they used, who positioned who, where, was the Arab countries weak, were they, it's not a book about the war. When Wiesel speaks about Israel and its victory, it's the Holocaust dead and the Holocaust survivors are pushing the Israeli military to victory. It's like a cosmic drama. And it's like a mass, a Catholic mass. You don't, when you hear a Catholic mass, you don't say, well, wait a minute, I'm not sure that happened that way. Or how do we know that Jesus did this or that, or the crucifixion? What do we know about that? You're swept into a story that isn't linear and isn't historical as the way we deal with history. And that's what Wiesel does with the Holocaust in Israel. And that's why he was also so popular among Christians, I believe. He developed a new liturgy, and the Kaddish is within Night, his autobiographical book about his time in the death camps. You have the Kaddish in Jewish life, which never mentions death. It's a prayer over the dead that doesn't mention death. But in the death camps, they often said the Kaddish before people died because there wouldn't be time and there wouldn't be people to say it over the people that died. And the new Kaddish is about Auschwitz and the smoke of burning children reaching the sky. And of course, it's also a critique of God, the question of where is God in this? And what does a Kaddish mean if there's no future? The Kaddish said at Jewish funeral services is about the coming kingdom of God. It doesn't mention death. But at Auschwitz, nothing was coming except more death.
Yeah. So yeah, so as since it's a theology, so the argument is God's where is God in Auschwitz, and that would be and when we go to Fackenheim and Greenberg, we will see how that theology about how do we speak about God in Auschwitz and with the empowerment of Israel. I think that would develop later.
Right.
Now,
too, that Wiesel is much more popular than Fackenheim or Greenberg.
Yeah, that's true. Now, going back to the 1967 war and how Wiesel look at that, the language that he uses, as you said, it's liturgical, and I actually heard this, that the victory in the 1967 war is a miracle, and to think that Holocaust theology, and as Fackenheim, now I'm going to Fackenheim, is a critique of modernity, and is the language used, the use of poetic and liturgical language, in that way, because it became more acceptable and popular. Does that mean it's actually a critique of the secularization of Jews?
Well, that's all. Yes, it's interesting because one Jewish writer wrote that Jews didn't really have questions about God by this time. Jews had basically said, Jews had in Europe had undergone a secularization. So really the question of God wasn't in the forefront until Holocaust theology raised the question of God's absence. So in a sense, although Holocaust theology does not say that God was present in the Holocaust, no way, and is also an argument with God. Where are you? Where were you? You said you'd be with us, but you weren't. And there are these things that there were trials of God in the camps, and God didn't fare very well because the arguments were too strong against God. And this is a whole tradition of arguing with God in the Jewish tradition. But in fact, it happened with me too, with Rubinstein, who had no belief in God at all after the Holocaust, although he was and is a rabbi. He introduced the question of God to me by negating God. And so Holocaust theology, in a sense, brings God back into the Jewish frame by saying, you are absent. We're taken over now. And Israel's empowerment, and this is what Emile Fackenheim says, in the 1967 war, was the commandment that came from the Jewish people, not from God, that we would fight and survive. The 614th commandment, there are 613 commandments of Orthodox Judaism, and Fackenheim says, well, if we lose, Hitler wins. The 614th commandment is, we, not God, we will not let that happen. Again, this was a collective sense among Jews that we weren't going to be dependent on outside powers, whether the Christian powers of Europe or anyone, and we weren't going to depend on God. After the Holocaust, the only one who could protect us is us. And so Fackenheim sees in the 1967 war and that victory, not only a miracle, as Wiesel would in a sense discuss it, but a commitment among Jews, a commanded victim. We commanded this. And now this is a commandment. It's not coming from God. We're not asking God. It doesn't matter what God has to say about it.
Yeah, the commanding voice of Auschwitz.
Yeah, and it's fantastic because, we even have these discussions about Christian prayer today and stuff, and Christians are tend to be so dependent on what is God, asking God for this and that. And Jews said, I'm not asking, we're doing. Now, whatever you think about Israel and what was done, what has been done and is being done in Israel, I like that sense. We have a responsibility because those who said they would protect us or should, including God, didn't do it. In fact, just the opposite.
Yeah. And in relation to that, you said that what Fackenheim declared, that commandment, that commanding voice of Auschwitz, was actually the end of Jewish martyrdom as a religious commandment. Can you explain more?
Yeah. Well, even I was raised with this sense of Jewish martyrdom throughout history. And the question in the Holocaust was, were the Jewish murdered victims or martyrs? I mean, after all, they were murdered because they were Jews, not because of whether they believed in God or what they believed in. They were murdered because they were Jews. And so the question in Holocaust theology, a very important question for all peoples, is when you experience the trauma of mass murder, are the people killed victims or martyrs? Victims would be just a waste. They're killed. It doesn't mean anything. But martyrs are the seeds of a new future beyond their death, in the name of their death. So Holocaust theology said these Jews, 6 million, were martyrs. Again, very liturgical. How do you prove whether they're victims or martyrs? This was the way that a people recognizes itself in history when it's being oppressed. that the people murdered, the Jews murdered, systematically murdered, one after the other. They didn't know their names. They didn't care. They didn't ask what they believed. They didn't care. They were Jews. Done. Wiesel says they were martyrs. And my teacher, Rubinstein, and this was a tremendous break, said, no, they were victims. And Wiesel and Fackenheim and Greenberg said, if we go with the fact that they were victims, then why be Jewish? But if they were martyrs, we're Jewish in their name, in the name of their suffering. What does that mean? No more martyrdom for Jews. We're done. Israel symbolizes for Fackenheim the end of Jewish martyrdom.
Now, you will no longer be a victim of...
Right. That we're done with that. That diaspora Jewishness had led to a long history of Jews being victims. The Holocaust was the end of that line. And all of them agreed that from now on, if you're going to take us down, we'll take you down with us. A very, this wasn't a turn the other cheek.
Yeah, that's a very drastic shift.
Very, very drastic shift, because remember, diaspora Jewry had no army. It had no court system for those who oppressed us. It had no police system to arrest those who were harassing us or killed us or whatever. This was a sea change. Now we had power. And one of the commands of that power was no more martyrdom. We will fight you to the end. If we die, you'll die with us. A very stark, and by the way, very understanding for a people who had suffered the way Jews had. When people dismiss the Holocaust or dismiss this theology as just ridiculous, they're wrong in my view. I don't support what happened within it. That's a different story. And we have other questions to ask, which Beyond Innocence and Redemption certainly does and directly does. But the idea that the Holocaust is not a formative event in Jewish history, or that Israel isn't, is wrong. The victims of European Jewry were not white or European considered by most Europeans. They were considered foreign. They were not white. So even the question of colonialism is very interesting and very complex. But the idea that Jews shouldn't have their own power to defend themselves after what we've been through, well, you have to be a person who doesn't know about community leadership and their responsibilities. Now, the responsibility of community leadership is to protect the people and to encourage the people to a new level of life. Can they commit crimes in doing that too? Yes. That's what I identify in Beyond Innocence and Redemption. And the Palestinians are the victims of Jewish victimization. And now Jewish martyrdom, the definition. And that's wrong. But the idea that Jews should simply say, oh, sorry that happened. Let's get on with life. That's a different story.
Yeah. Yes. So is that in a way displays the rabbinic theology, and is rabbinic theology somehow blamed for the powerlessness of Jews, for their suffering?
Richard Rubinstein did blame the rabbis, but understood. And the way it was framed, again, in formative events in Jewish history, was that when Jews were defeated and the temple was destroyed, the rabbis made a deal with the Romans. Now, of course, this is also mythical history, but important in Jewish psyche. And the idea that the deal was that we would no longer be a collective. We would no longer assert our rights as a collective. We'd no longer fight you. We would be a diaspora Jewry, and we would have synagogues, and we would pray, and we would do our religious rituals, but we wouldn't touch or try to touch your power. And what Rubinstein and actually all of the Holocaust theologians said was that may have been necessary for Jews to survive then, but it weakened us, left us vulnerable, and now look what happened. We can never be that vulnerable again. We need a new way of looking at ourselves and a new way of empowerment so that anyone tempted to do that would not be able to. And if they were able to some extent, we would take them down with us. And in fact, it did end rabbinic Judaism in many ways, although the rabbis ultimately who opposed parts of this dynamic, seeing Holocaust and Israel as formative for good reason, because that's not how the rabbinic system was built. They then, over time, hitched a ride on Holocaust theology, and that's how they survived, but it was very much changed. And you can even see in many synagogues, you'll have monuments to the Holocaust and Israeli flags. This was unknown in the Jewish world before. So the Holocaust theology said to Jews in a very powerful way, that history which you lived and were trained in is over. We cannot afford it. We have a new history. We can take some of that with us under this new banner. And that's what happened.
Yeah, in a way, in a way, the rabbinic theology, in a way, have adopted Holocaust theology. I'm just reading just now before our conversation. I'm reading an article on Mondevise about this synagogue in New York, where the rabbi would talk about would honor his son who is serving in the IDF, and then all of them they would praise the establishment of the state of Israel, a part of the Yom Kippur service.
Yeah, well, this has become, and then there are Jewish holy days in the Jewish calendar now that are about Israeli independence and about the martyrdom of Jews in the Holocaust. So, religion changes and a people's consciousness changes. And this was a sea change in Jewish life. It upended it, it changed it almost completely, but then the symbols of the past are brought in too. In a sense, the Holocaust in Israel ended diaspora Jewry. There was a compression, first of all, the massive loss of Jewish life, in a sense, the end of European Jewry. Then smaller Jewish communities left their places, often went to Israel or to the States. And we have most Jews, 80, 90%, who live now in America and Israel, two empires, where Jews are empowered. So in effect, the Holocaust and the creation of the state of Israel and Holocaust theology ended diaspora Jewry. And the Jews who talk about being diaspora Jews exist within this empowerment, but not just an elite among Jews who are empowered, but empowerment throughout the Jewish community. So it's an illusion when we talk about diaspora Jewishness now, in my view, unless we say it's under the canopy of empire.
But what about the Jews who do not live in the U.S. or Israel? For example, they live in places where, they remain a minority. Do they also, benefit from that? In part, for example, Jews that live here in the Philippines, or Jews that live in Brazil or Argentina?
Yeah, well, these are minority groups who have their own lives and sometimes identify with the US and Israel and sometimes don't. But there's not only a great concentration of Jews in the United States and Israel, the United Kingdom and France. When you get into all of that, you get a great percentage of the Jewish population. And the diaspora, if you look at the map in 1920 of Jews in the world, and then you look at it in 1945, and then you look at it in 1970, it's changed dramatically. And so most Jews are either living within empire or linked to empire. And there are Jews who are dissenting, but they dissent within an empire framework. Most Jews today don't know what it's like to live without empire being the defining aspect of Jewish life.
So you are very much entangled with empire.
Well, of course we are. And this is part of our empowerment and part of the critique of contemporary Jewish life. But it needs to be noted that Jews benefit from empire, are empowered within empire, and part of it is a Jewish empire in Israel with our own army, military. This is a siege, almost a total change in Jewish history. It's very difficult to imagine another people who has gone through this change in such a short time. And what we've done with it for good and what we've done with it for bad is at issue. But the overall decision of the Jewish people is to live under the canopy of empire. And that was a decision that was made collectively just by where people moved, how people live, what they pledged their allegiance to after the Holocaust. And this goes back to Fackenheim, no more Jewish martyrs. Now, in Beyond Innocence and Redemption, I talk about, and in Jewish Theology of Liberation, the fact that we are now creating martyrs. Holocaust theology doesn't go near that. That's the question then. And I'll tell you a story. Of course, Abraham Joshua Heschel is this great Jewish figure, European figure, who was, by the way, quite controversial in his life. Quite controversial. He is worshipped almost as an icon today, but if you read about him, and I've written some about him, he was quite controversial and quite dismissive of American Jewry in many, many ways. Richard Rubinstein was a student of Heschel's, and I was a student of Rubinstein. And I invited him to my center at Baylor, Rubinstein. I met Heschel in 1972, right before he died, but I was just a student, didn't know who I was. And I said to Rubinstein, what was it like? Because Rubinstein broke with Heschel. Heschel had survived the Holocaust. It meant many of his family members had died. But he didn't give up on God. He had arguments with God, but he didn't give up on God or the covenant or Jewish spirituality, whereas Rubinstein broke with him. And after Auschwitz, he begins with that break. So they were fierce, not enemies, but fiercely at odds. So I asked Rubinstein this last time I saw him, what was it like to deal with Heschel, to go into Heschel's office, and what did you feel like? And he said to me, Marc, when you went into Heschel, he exuded Eastern European Jewry. It just was exuded from him. And there was no way I could ever be like him. I could never know Jewishness the way he knew it. But I knew what I needed to know, which is something that Heschel, in Rubinstein's view, didn't know. And that was Jewish empowerment, although Heschel was on board with that, but also a Holocaust theology, which Heschel was not. Mm-hmm. And listening to Rubinstein, I thought to myself, I can never know as much about Jewishness and exude it the way you do, but I know what I need to know. What I needed to know was Palestinians. So when I argue with Holocaust theology, I don't dismiss it. That's way too easy. way too easy. And I don't say it's a fabrication or simply a dreamlike covering up crimes. It did all of that. But it was a deep reckoning with Jewish history. But they left out something very important. If we oppress another people, can that be our redemption?
Yes. Speaking of, the question of God, and I'd like to go. I'd like to read a passage before we go to Greenberg. I think because I think Greenberg occupies a large portion of chapter 1 and 2. But on before we leave Wiesel and Fackenheim, they said something about the question of God, the question of God's presence in Jewish history. And I would just like to read this, and maybe you could comment on this. The events of Holocaust in Israel are also tied to the question of God's presence in Jewish history. And both Wiesel and Fackenheim address this difficulty with a courage rare among theologians. In a sense, both refuse to abandon God. So, where is God is in Auschwitz, but that remained the question. Even if both entertain the possibility that God abandoned the Jewish people in the death camps. Typically, Wiesel is evocative in this regard, especially in his autobiographical work, Night. Fackenheim, as a philosopher, is more systematic in his God's presence in history and a later work, To Mend the World. What they agree on is that in the dialectical tension of suffering and empowerment, innocence and redemption, the question of God remains. For Wiesel and Fackenheim, and for all subsequent Holocaust theology, it is this historical reality that must be preserved in fidelity to those who have died. Ultimately, Holocaust theology then is seen as an act of fidelity to the dead by the living who refused to answer the questions that the dead and the dying could not.
Correct. Holocaust theology reintroduces God into the Jewish vocabulary as a way of making sure that the victims of Auschwitz are not discarded. That's martyrdom.
So
Don't say,
it's an act of
but
fidelity.
they don't say that. Yes, it's an act of fidelity to the dead, and I understand that. Yes, because if you just see the victims of mass death, those who were murdered, as a byproduct of an event or as something not worth remembering, or as just victims who were killed for no reason.
Mm-hmm.
But if you recognize that they were killed or believe they were killed, and that you had a relationship with their death, which is to bring life. And why would you bring life? Well, the question of God is there. And by the way, none of the Holocaust theologians say, oh yeah, well, Israel proves that God exists. You would say, well, maybe the Holocaust says God's absent, and with Israel, God's present. No, they don't say that. They won't go there. They maintain that the Holocaust is definitive of God's absence, but notice that the absence is argued with. I had students at Baylor, Christian students, who were so good about wanting to understand Jewishness and trying to understand something that was quite foreign to them. They were so respectful. And when they read Night, which basically says that God isn't there, they were concerned primarily not that Elie Wiesel didn't accept Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. They were evangelical Christians. But that Elie Wiesel may have lost his faith in God. Now, this was very respectful of them. But as I pointed out, on your first date with a woman or a man, you can't get into an argument because you can't remember their last name. You're just meeting them. But if you've been with somebody for many, many years, you can have a knockdown, drag out, or it's a form of, sometimes, and I don't want to push this too far, being able to argue with somebody is a form of intimacy. So Elie Wiesel's Night is a argument with God who is intimate to Elie Wiesel.
So, in a sense, and this is my own reading, that the connection of God with the empowerment of Jews in the state of Israel, it's more of a Christian connection rather than Jews.
Well, there's different
among Christian Zionists.
Yeah, well, that's a whole nother story. But Jews in general, and again, there are always specific differences, in general, do not see Israel as God's hand. Christian Zionists might. Israel is seen as a Jewish response to the Holocaust. And it was. But again, there was something left out, very important. But Holocaust theology, this is it's so interesting that it brings up the question of God in a very traditional Jewish way. That is, the argument with God is a form of intimacy with God. And the ability of Jews in the covenant, which goes back, way back, to say, look, yeah, you have certain things we have to do, okay, and we don't always do them, but you've made it clear. But by the way, you also told us certain things that you would do. And some of them you've kept, but some of them you're not. So we're going to have a discussion about this. And by the way, we have a right to hold our own and to stand on our own 2 feet. We're not just going to listen to your answers. If you don't deliver, we're going to argue. That's a whole tradition, and a beautiful tradition, part of Jewish life. And I believe that night is an argument with an intimate God, but with the stakes very high. Not the Lent, I'll give up cigarettes for Lent. This is real stuff, or no chocolates for Lent. This is a formative event that the ending is not pleasing or pleasant, but terribly destructive. So that Jews stayed in that argument. Now, of course, not all Jews do, and of course, many secular Jews say, I reject God completely. But when they reject God completely so vociferously, you think to yourself, why does it mean so much? Why are you so angry? If it doesn't mean anything to you, just let it go.
It's also a form of Jewishness.
The thing, Jewishness is not about Judaism. Judaism is a subset within Jewishness and not at the top of the list. And God also is not in the top of the list. God's on the list. And I love that about being Jewish, because it says that I have a right as a person, and we have a right as a people, to stand on our own 2 feet. And we're going to have a discussion, and we'll walk with you, you walk with us. And if we have to part company, then we have to part company. And when we part company, we know that we're always parting company. It's like years ago, I was reading Jeremiah, and it just became too much for me. I was identifying too much with Jeremiah. So I closed my book, the Jeremiah, and but every time I walked by it, I thought to myself, I'm not reading Jeremiah.
So the relationship is not through thick and thin, till death do us part.
It is through thin, but distance can be very important through thick and thin. And distance can be a form of intimacy. Yeah, intimacy isn't only closeness that you can see. distance can be a form of intimacy too. And with Jewish life, that is very true. It's like, God, you're over there, stay over there, back off.
I remember when you said that in front of my students, and one of the sister cried because she just couldn't stand you telling God to back off, and then you made her cry.
I felt bad about that, but I
You
still
remember
believe.
that?
Of course I remember that. And I said to myself, well, she's crying and I want to reach out to her, which I did.
Yeah.
But sometimes you have to say to God, back off.
Yeah.
And Jewish tradition, parts of it, God appreciates that. Yeah. I mean, the idea that God is only a commanding God in Jewish life is wrong. And you can even see this in the Torah and the other books. And Jewish history is a conversation with this very, very particular God. And part of that conversation, not the only part, but part of it is back off. Give me space to breathe. I'm a human being, and you're not defining it all.
Yeah, it's
About, and this is where Jewish comedy comes from too, I believe. The beauty of it is God would say, yeah, all right, I hear you.
that
I
is true.
point.
Yeah, it's Saturday Night Live
Well,
kind of
I
comedy.
must say, I believe that Jewish comedy comes from this long history, including in the Bible, where you have this covenant that nobody fulfills. The people don't do it, God doesn't do it. And you have to constantly negotiate the two sides, but you can't have a negotiation if one party is so strong that the other party doesn't exist. That's a dictatorship. And in Jewish history, if you look at it, and even in this liturgy of destruction, which we'll discuss at another time, you have this discussion, this conversation, very powerful and defining conversation, which Christianity and Islam tried to foreshorten or close down. That's another theme of mine. They basically said, we can't have that continuing discussion. We have to have a focal point where it ends. So Jesus or Muhammad. But Jews have said repeatedly, no, that's not going to work. And that's one of the reasons I'm very grateful for being Jewish. I have a right to say to God, back off. And God can say what God wants to say to me too. But ultimate power over me? No.
Yeah, it reminds me of Levinas religion for the adults. That chapter that we read in our Jewish theology and the prophetic. Anyway, so let me go back to our discussion on your. Although this is also about the book, but in an extended form. And now I would like to talk discuss about Rabbi Irving Greenberg's. You said that he sort of complete the Holocaust theology, and he added that dimension of specialness and normalization. You know, Fackenheim and Wiesel reflected on the dialectic of suffering and empowerment and innocence and redemption. With Greenberg, he pushes it further, and that formed the third dimension of Holocaust theology, which you call the third era of Jewish history, that emphasizes specialness and normalization. Now, when I read this part, and you have really really studied Rabbi Greenberg's ideas, and he talks about you have you pointed out the three main items in his writings. One is power. Second is state theology, and the third is the new anti-Semitism. Let's talk about power first. And although this has already been um, pointed out by Wiesel and Fackenheim, um, uh, Greenberg said something about Jewish powerlessness, and he called it Jewish powerlessness is immoral, for it is no longer compatible with Jewish survival. So in a sense, and you mentioned it spells the loss of innocence. Um,
Well,
Greenberg was
Greenberg is wrestling with the fact he's the first Holocaust theologian to really wrestle with the fact that Jews have power.
mhm,
Rubinstein did too, but Rubinstein said, we have power and we're going to do what we need to do. Don't tell us what to do with it, and don't introduce moral or justice concerns. We're going to do what we need to do because we've been disempowered and because of the Holocaust. So don't lecture me on morality. Greenberg took some of his thought, but also Wiesel's and Fackenheim, and said, well, I agree with parts of all of them, and I want to do a somewhat new formulation or sum up Holocaust theology as we have it by introducing these categories. And what Greenberg argues, again, very Jewishly, he doesn't want to give up on the idea that Jews are a special people and there's something special about being Jewish, especially in the ethical realm. But he also won't give up on power because that's for him a sin after our history. So we have to hold these two together. We're special, but we have a special vocation in the world, historically and now. But we also need to have power, because without power we won't survive. So we have to survive, but with part of our specialness intact. But in surviving, we have to give up part of our specialness, because if we're too special, we won't survive. It's a fantastic argument, and it's very interesting. And that's what he means by normalization. And this is what he's writing during the Palestinian uprising. And while I'm writing Beyond Innocence and Redemption, the ethics of Jewish power. The ethics of Jewish power. Now, typically when you have power, you don't talk about ethics, you just use your power. But for Greenberg, he says, we've got to wrestle with this. We can't be too special and too ethical, we won't survive. But if we use our power indiscriminately, we won't be special. We have to come, so we're undergoing a process of normalization. This is a difficult thing for Jews, which means we now have power, which means we're going to do some things that are not ethical. Yeah. We prized ourselves on only being ethical. Whether we were only ethical or not is another issue. But we think of ourselves as primarily ethical. But now with power, we have to give up some of that. We're becoming more normal. We have to become more normal. But in becoming more normal, we're going to do things that are wrong. And if we go ballistic because we do something that is wrong within our power, we might undermine our empowerment. So Greenberg, again, as a leader of a people in a leadership position, assuming leadership in that, he's trying to negotiate for us and have us understand how we can still be special and have power and do things that are wrong, but our specialness will also help correct that wrongness so we can survive. Otherwise, we'll become like the other nations. Now we're going back to the Bible.
Yeah, but isn't the becoming normal? It's like you're going to be like any other nations, any other people who would.
Greenberg says we're going to become somewhat like other people, somewhat like the other nations, but not we're not going to become the other nations.
And what
Now,
would ensure that? The ethics?
well, what would ensure that is the storehouse of ethical history that Jews have, and this kind of built-in antenna, in a way, that say to Jews, okay, we've done this wrong, and we may have needed to do this wrong in order to survive, but we shouldn't do too much of the wrong, otherwise we're going to become like them, and then who are we? It's a very Jewish argument about specialness. And Greenberg, again, he even has he wants to make it quantitative, is how special can we be and survive? Well, we can't be 90%, 100% special, 90%, 80%, 70%, 60%, 50%, but we can be 10% better than the others. But we can't go to zero, because then why be Jewish? See, Greenberg is an Orthodox rabbi, and although he's very creative within his orthodoxy and seen as a renegade, he's actually quite traditional. In the third era of Jewish history, as he describes it, defined by the Holocaust and empowerment in the state of Israel. So we have to keep this negotiation between specialness and normalization. So we're not too special, therefore not survive, or too normal and therefore not survive in a way, because the great threat in the Hebrew Bible is to become like the other nations.
Yeah.
That's the great threat throughout Jewish history. And the negotiation is, how can we survive being so special? Now, other people may not see Jews as special, or they may say this is ridiculous, but it's very Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
And I certainly understand it. And Greenberg is, who was unknown to me and was publishing these pamphlets, but turned out to be very powerful in the Jewish community, which I didn't know, because I was marginal to the Jewish community growing up in South Florida in the 1950s and 60s, not the Florida of today. And a rabbi once asked me, he said, after I wrote about Greenberg so much, he said, do you know who Irving Greenberg is? I said, well, he's a rabbi, and he's an Orthodox rabbi, and he's written this and that, these pamphlets. He said, Marc, do you know who Rabbi Irving Greenberg is? I said, well, I just told you what I know of him. He said, he's one of the most powerful figures in American Jewry. And I said, oh. In other words, he was cautioning me about taking on Greenberg, although I do so in a respectful way. And Greenberg is fascinating in this specialness and normalization, and this negotiation that he believed Jews, and of course he's doing this in the uprising where there are many Jews, and part of Beyond Innocence and Redemption is cataloging the upset within the Jewish world that occurred during these years, 1988, 1989, 1990, where it became obvious to Jews what was obvious to Palestinians many years before, mm-hmm. that we, in our empowerment, we weren't innocent. And Greenberg said, you're right. We can't afford to be innocent, but we're not like the others. We can't afford that either. So his essay, written in the middle of the Palestinian uprising, is trying to negotiate the fact that it doesn't look like we're innocent in our empowerment, and we're not, but okay, be careful. Because if you get so upset about our normalization, the prophetic is going to come back. And the prophetic, condemning what we are doing that is normal, can undermine our empowerment. We can be very special and not exist at all. So Greenberg's analysis, like all of Holocaust theology, is an attempt to discipline the Jewish prophetic that is now coming home and criticizing Jewish empowerment after the Holocaust. And Greenberg is very clear. If you criticize Jewish empowerment too much, that is for Jews, if they do that, you may intentionally or unintentionally undermine the state of Israel, which would create a second Holocaust.
Yeah, that's his definition of the new anti-Semitism.
The new
Uh,
anti-Semitism carried on by others who are not Jewish and within the Jewish community. It's
yeah,
not about hatred of Jews or Jewish discrimination against Jews. It's about undermining the power of Israel,
yeah, but
which
the
is
way he
how
said, yeah, the way he said it is that if you're Jewish and you criticize Israel for using its power, then you're an anti-Semite.
yes, or what he calls a self-hating Jew. But he doesn't say you can't criticize Israel because that's part of being special. You
Uh-huh.
can't criticize it too.
It's what?
You can't criticize. You can't criticize it too much.
Uh-huh. Yeah, to
So
that
criticism
question,
allowed.
its existence. Yeah, it's right to exist.
Criticism within the understanding that Israel should exist and be empowered. That's possible. But
Mhm.
if you go too far and you undermine Jewish empowerment in Israel, you're guilty of a great sin, the greatest sin of our era. Because that leads, in his mind, or could lead, to a
To another
second.
Holocaust. Yeah. Now I want to because I want to uh, ask you what about this very very intriguing statement and um, and this is about his views on power. Um, the truly he says actually you said the truly moral in your interpretation of uh, Greenberg, the truly moral do not avoid using power because of its ambiguity. Rather, they act only when necessary and seek to keep suffering caused by their actions to a minimum. The moral principle is thus in place. Accepting as given that evil cannot be avoided, there is still an ideal way of exercising power. So he is he saying that you should take an ambiguous stance in relation to power, that you cannot avoid collateral damage, and so that you have to take that as that's the cost of empowerment, that you would have collateral damage, and that is fine as long as you keep it to the minimum.
Yes, you don't want it, but you have to accept it. And if you start crying too much about it, you won't be able to exercise power. Yeah, he's trying to help Jews negotiate the fact that we are special and normal, and that we're not either or. Yeah. All, by the way, Freud was considered by some to be negotiating the Jewish entry into modernity. That is, psychoanalysis has a lot to do with that. So Jewish thinkers, like other thinkers, are negotiating for the people. And Greenberg is saying, don't be so ethical. Don't think that you're perfect and you can survive the world. We know we can't. And don't think you're always just so much better than everybody, because we can't survive that. There will be things that Israel does that are wrong, and you can judge them as wrong. But that's going to happen because we need power. But try to limit it because we're special. Only do what's necessary. And so he looks at Palestinians in that way too. Palestinians may deserve to be free within the context of Jewish empowerment. Don't push them too far, but don't let them push you. And that's his basic sense of Israel. So we have to adjust. We want to think of ourselves as this moral, ethical people, and there are going to be things in the headlines that American Jews are going to read that don't look good about Israel. Why did you do that? And some of those things are wrong,
Mm-hmm.
but some of those things are necessary. And you've got to start thinking in a rational way about that, not just an emotional way about what does that mean to my Jewishness, and what does that mean about our specialness? Man up.
Toughen up.
That's what, yeah, yeah, man up and stay special. But if you don't push people around sometimes, you're going to get pushed around. And we know what happens when Jews are pushed around. This is Greenberg's, in a vernacular way, this is Greenberg's theology. And he takes a lot of it, I think, from Reinhold Niebuhr about moral man, immoral society. Yeah, and when I invited him to Maryknoll in 1988, I was sitting at a table with Greenberg and Harvey Cox, and they were talking about Niebuhr. And if I remember correctly, Greenberg attended a class or some classes with Niebuhr at some point in New York at Union. And I think if you read Greenberg's analysis, he has a very Niebuhrian sense of moral man, immoral society, or moral Jews and immoral empowerment, and trying to connect the two and keep them in some kind of tension.
Mm-hmm. So yeah. So before we wrap up this conversation, because that's basically the arguments of Rabbi Greenberg. Um, you know, I'm thinking about how all of these discussions are being taken up now still, or all of this Holocaust theology, the use of power, have they taken another form, or basically this is still the arguments 30 years later?
Well, when Greenberg wrote the essay, The Ethics of Jewish Power, in 1988, that was the last thing written on Holocaust theology, the last creative attempt. But that's deep within the Jewish conversation, even when it isn't mentioned. Obviously, Greenberg's essay isn't mentioned by ordinary Jews. But the sense that Jews have suffered and need power and need to show that power at certain times is still there. But the situation has worsened so much that there's very little public discussion of Israel's innocence, of the Holocaust as functioning as a reason for Israel. So a lot of that has dropped out, but I think it's still there in the basic conversation patterns of Jews, subconsciously and sometimes consciously. But the Holocaust theologians, although Greenberg is still alive, and Rubinstein, they're older, and Wiesel and Fackenheim are no longer. The writing of Holocaust theology is over, and the ability to argue it in public is over. I think it needs to be known because you don't understand the Jewish argument for Israel without understanding Holocaust theology. Whether you use those names of the people who wrote it or not is immaterial. Otherwise, we get into a superficial discussion of Israel, why it's there, what it does, and which I think mostly we are in a superficial discussion about it, partly because people are ambivalent about Jewish power and ambivalent about Jews, and partly because of the abuse of Jewish power in Israel and in the United States. So it's very difficult to talk about Jewish matters in any depth today because of the ambivalence about Jews and because what Jews have done with our power.
It's true that somehow Holocaust theology has left the public and political arena, because I encountered Holocaust theology already within the realm of biblical studies and interreligious dialogue. So when I first encountered it, I never really connected with it anything political. It was more really in the context of biblical studies, of Jewish Christian dialogue. Do you think that's a that is a diminishment of a Holocaust theology, that it has been cut off from the political and public uh,
Well, I
discussion?
think it's still there. I think it's still there. It's just not discussed so overtly. And when you have interreligious dialogue, for instance, recently in the Philippines, and you invite an American Jew who lives in Israel, the head of one of the people of the Christians and Jews, and this stuff is so retro that most people don't listen to it anymore, and rightly so. But the depth of Jewish particularity is very important, and you can't understand Israel without it. But that isn't the end of the discussion.
Okay. So with that, Dr. Ellis, thank you so much. This is a very engaging. I've learned so much just by I'm just by reading chapter 1 on the birth of Holocaust theology. It has made me appreciate the complex
Yeah,
discussions around Holocaust. It's
I
not
be,
just simply, Jews suffered, and because and now they're because they were they suffered and they were innocent, and now they should be empowered, and that justifies the empowerment. Yeah. So I
yeah.
didn't. What
Well,
I got here is the tradition of descent that's went
yeah.
around it.
Well, thank you for remembering my book. I'm often thought of as a symbolic figure, positive or negative, but actually, if you read me, we can all learn together, maybe.
Yeah. So thank you, Dr. Ellis. And our next, the next part of this discussion would be on the tradition of descent, and then we will talk about as you already mentioned, the inclusive liturgy of destruction, which is very more. It has become more relevant today. So with that, thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you for making time.
Well, thank you.